You really can't argue about where the loneliest, toughest environment on the planet is. That title goes to Antarctica, a colossal landmass that actually dwarfs both Europe and Australia in sheer size. Despite that scale, nobody is originally from there, making it the only continent deemed totally unlivable for humans because of the brutal freeze and emptiness. We are talking about the absolute coldest,
in a very
most
specific
windswept,
niche
and surprisingly
along the
driest
coastline
place
shown
on Earth.
here.
Consequently, people aren't the only ones steering clear. The vast majority of wildlife avoids it too, and yes, contrary to what cartoons suggest, that includes polar bears. Here is a wild fact. The biggest creature that lives on the land there year-round is technically a bug, because that is exactly what it is. A tiny insect known as the Antarctic midge. That little guy officially takes the crown as the continent's top land predator. But even he sticks to the coastal strips where the ice melts, leaving the deep interior completely void of anything except microscopic life. So, by practically every definition, it is a dead zone buried under ice. And we are talking serious depth. Some layers plunge down nearly 3 miles, or roughly 4.8 kilometers. To put that in perspective, about 70% of the planet's fresh water is locked up down there in frozen blocks. But here is the twist. Antarctica wasn't always a frozen hellscape. Actually, from a geological perspective, this deep freeze is a pretty recent development. Go back about 34 million years
forming
to
a
the
crucial
Eocene
piece
epoch,
of the supercontinent
and the landscape
Gondwana.
wasn't white,
The
it was
latitude of
green,
ancient
lush,
Antarctica
and
was
teeming
much
with
higher
big
than its
animals,
current position,
right up until the Cenozoic
equivalent
Ice
to the
Age
temperate
hit.
South
However, even though that was its last green phase, it wasn't exactly the continent's prime. To see Antarctica at its absolute wildest, you have to rewind the clock much further. You would need to jump back before mammals even took over, straight into the reign of the dinosaurs, specifically the Jurassic period. Now, the Jurassic wasn't the absolute peak of insanity for the region, but it was a crucial chapter that paved the way for everything else. Back then, the supercontinent Pangaea had been fracturing for ages. However, a surprising chunk of it was still holding together, including Antarctica.
This map highlights
Unlike
the
the
Hansen
isolated
Formation
block it is
and
today,
Mount Kirkpatrick,
it was attached to
whose
several
treacherous
neighbors,
slopes remain
sharing
buried
borders
under
with
massive
Australia,
glaciers
India,
today.
and the massive Gondwana landmass. And although it sat further south in most places, it wasn't hugging the pole like it does now. Its position was actually closer to where southern Chile and Argentina sit today.
These species show the
That
incredible
location,
diversity.
mixed with the toasty Mesozoic climate thanks to high carbon dioxide levels, meant the land was hot, verdant, and completely free of ice. If you booked a vacation there in that era, your mind would be blown. Forget the endless white glaciers and rocky outcrops. Dense forests covered the land, filled with ancient pines, ferns, and benedictales. Instead of a flat white void, the surface was crisscrossed with rivers, lakes, and swamps, creating a vibrant ecosystem that wasn't just scenic, but actually habitable. Since it was still bridged to the rest of the world, animals naturally migrated down there. This is the era, the early Jurassic, when the first known dinosaurs started stomping around the continent. The most valuable site for fossils from this time is the Hansen Formation. And no, not the pop band, but a dig site on Mount Kirkpatrick, dating back to the Middle Cinemerian Age. It is buried in glaciers now, but back then, temperatures hovered around 17 to 18 degrees Celsius, feeling a lot like southern Chile does today. This was the stomping ground for dinosaurs like Chelophysoids and small neotheropods, plus ornithischians and plenty of massospondylids. Those last ones were early ancestors of the longnecks hyli, primitive creatures that didn't look like the giants you were used to. Many walked on 2 legs and were shockingly small, barely bigger than a deer. Then again, you had heavy hitters like Glacialosaurus, which was much bigger, growing up to 20 feet or 6 meters,
we see a
and weighing about as much as an
bone
Asian
structure.
elephant. What is truly fascinating is that this version of Antarctica was kind of an evolutionary time capsule. You had these archaic proto-longnecks living side by side with the newer, evolved sauropods. It is like if ancient cavemen suddenly showed up and started renting apartments next to us today. Pretty wild stuff. But the downside, along with the cool dinos, the place was crawling with bugs that definitely don't live there anymore. We are talking swarms of beetles, and yes, cockroaches. Here is the kicker. Modern Antarctica is the solitary continent where a human could trek across the ice for, let's say, eternity, and be 100% certain they won't get devoured, since the biggest predator is just that tiny mite I mentioned. But flip the script to the Jurassic, and it was a nightmare. Over at Hansen Hill, you would have encountered the Cryolophosaurus, a name that translates to frozen crested lizard. First dug up in 1994, This beast was stomping through the southern lands about 194 million years ago and earned the nickname Elvosaurus. Not for its pretty face, obviously, but for that strange, pompadour-style crest sitting on its skull, stretching from ear to ear. That bony ridge was actually incredibly fragile and hollow, leading experts to think it served the same purpose as Elvis's hair, purely for showing off to potential mates. And interestingly, it looks like both males and females sported the look. However, the comparison to the King of Rock ends right there, because this creature was a stone-cold killer with zero evidence of singing talent, and remains the single largest land predator ever found in Antarctica. Full-grown adults clocked in at around 7 meters, or 23 feet, and tipped the scales at anywhere from half a ton to 2/3 of a ton. That also crowns it as the biggest theropod of the early Jurassic. So, while the frozen continent today hosts some of the tiniest hunters on the planet, it was once the domain of giants. Armed with massive limbs, sharp claws, and curved teeth built to lock onto victims, the Cryolophosaurus likely enjoyed a varied menu, mostly consisting of other dinosaurs. We know this from bite marks left on fossilized bones. But they weren't picky. Smaller critters, like flying reptiles and mammal-like cousins, were on the chopping block too, especially for the younger predators. And it turns out, even other cases, Cryolophosaurs weren't safe. We have found multiple skeletons showing clear signs of cannibalism and scavenging, including one gruesome scene where a juvenile had stripped the meat off a much larger adult carcass, I suppose. Anything looks like dinner if you are hungry enough. Those marks of them eating their own kind hint at a brutal reality in ancient Antarctica. It suggests life was incredibly harsh and dangerous, possibly even more volatile than today. Paleontologists have found thick layers of volcanic ash in the rock formations, proving that massive local eruptions were a regular occurrence. These blasts would have unleashed deadly pyroclastic flows and lava, which in turn likely sparked wildfires intense enough to completely reshape the terrain, burning up resources and putting the entire ecosystem under extreme stress. Naturally, that spelled disaster for anything living there at the time. However, that destruction actually laid the groundwork for fertile soil down the line, which may explain why life kept booming. The Jurassic wasn't even the peak for this continent. As the supercontinent Pangaea kept breaking apart, Antarctica was slowly dragged further away. By 20 million years after the Hansen Hill fossils were laid down, Antarctica had fully split from Gondwana and drifted deeper south. It wasn't totally alone yet, though. It kept some connections to the world. Then, 50 million years later, India decided to leave the party and drifted off on its own, leaving just Antarctica and Australia together. It is kind of funny, considering Australia was once referred to as Antarctica on old maps. But setting semantics aside, the reality is that while joined, those two landmasses swapped and shared a lot of the same wildlife. Eventually, even that partnership dissolved. When the late Cretaceous rolled around about 85 million years ago, Antarctica was essentially on its own, only linked to neighbors by temporary land bridges now and then. The Cretaceous didn't just bring isolation. It brought a major shift in the continents. Weather. The region became humid and seasonal, with average temperatures climbing higher than before, which fits, since the Cretaceous was a warmer era globally. Ancient soil. Analysis tells us that late Cretaceous Antarctica was similar to modern temperate zones. In the summer, temperatures could hit highs of 25 degrees Celsius, or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That is basically the same as the yearly average in Kenya today. By this point, the forests had completely transformed too, dominated by podocarps, Araucarian conifers, and the rapidly spreading angiosperms, better known as flowering plants. The scenery would have looked shockingly similar to the forests we see today where the Nothofagus genus thrives, looking a little something like this. Sounds pretty nice, does it not? I will go ahead and answer that for you, absolutely. But there were still some strange things going on in the match. Living on this continent was a hard sell, mostly because of the grueling long nights. You see, when winter rolled around, it didn't just visit, it moved in, bringing a darkness that refused to leave. Researchers believe this region could, quite literally, have endured 4 straight months of pitch black, illuminated only by the moon, the stars, and the faint eerie glow of volcanoes. But to quote a certain chaotician, life, finds a way. It was actually during the late Cretaceous that Antarctica hit its stride, entering a true golden age where the continent and its oceans teemed with a wild variety of creatures, including a rapidly expanding cast of dinosaurs. One of the most common locals was likely the ankylosaur, specifically a guy known as Antarctipelta. This was a stocky, medium-sized tank, stretching about 4 to 6 meters, or 12 to 20 feet, and weighing roughly the same as a female bison. Like its cousins overseas, it was covered in osteoderms, hard, bony plates that wrapped around its body, creating a heavy-duty shield to ward off predators and general hazards. But the real threat wasn't the armor, it was the tail. Now, unlike the famous Ankylosaurus, this Antarctic resident didn't have a solid bone club. Instead, it packed something arguably nastier. As those bony plates moved down the tail, they began to stretch and flatten out, creating a structure that looks suspiciously like a macuoidal. If you're not up on your history, that's the iconic jagged sword used by Mesoamerican warriors. Picture a wooden club lined with razor-sharp obsidian blades, a weapon conquistadors claimed could decapitate a horse in a single blow. Now, picture a biological version of that weapon attached to a bison-sized dinosaur. Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to be standing behind it. But this begs the question, who was this tail built to fight? Allow me to introduce you to the likely suspect, the terror of Antarctica, Imperobator, which translates to powerful warrior. At first glance, this thing might look like a fluffy version of a Jurassic Park raptor, but it wasn't a velociraptor. In fact, despite the family resemblance, it might not even be a dromaeosaur, considering it's currently classified as a Unenlagini. This is a group of Paravians traditionally lumped in with dromaeosaurs, but experts are starting to view them as their own distinct lineage. One of the heavy hitters in this group is Ostroraptor, one of the biggest Paravians ever found, measuring a massive 6 meters
beneath the
or 20 feet and weighing half a ton.
Its sheer scale.
It seems size ran in the family because Imperobator was also a giant among Paravians, clocking in at over 3 meters or 10 feet long and built like a tank. Now, unlike the typical dromaeosaurids, Imperobator seemed to lack that famous sickle claw on its foot, but don't let your guard down, it was still an absolute killing machine, using powerful limbs and a mouthful of curved, serrated teeth to tear prey to shreds. As you might have guessed, Imperobator was fully feathered, a feature that kept it cozy during the freezing months, while its massive eyes gave it a distinct tactical advantage when the long, dark winter nights set in. I don't know about you, but the idea of being stalked in total darkness by a giant, intelligent raptor is pure nightmare fuel. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only monster roaming the Antarctic. While we haven't identified it yet, paleontologists confirm that at least one other type of carnivorous theropod stalked these lands. We know next to nothing about this mystery contender, but based on the few bones we have, it stood around 2.4 meters, or roughly 8 feet tall. It was likely a Megaraptoran, which, if you haven't seen my video on them, is a gruesome group of predators that use massive hand claws to gut and skewer prey, eating them like a prehistoric shish kebab. So, yeah, that's another creature you definitely want to avoid on your next time travel vacation. On the less terrifying side of things, Cretaceous Antarctica hosted plenty of ornithopods like Mosasaurus and Trinosaura, alongside early waterfowl, neornithenines, ornithurans, and various elasmosaurs patrolling the waters. These creatures kept the ecosystem vibrant and diverse. But sure, they weren't exactly the towering giants we usually associate with dinosaurs. However, recent discoveries suggest that Cretaceous Antarctica may have also hosted the largest family of land animals in history, the sauropods. Specifically, researchers found an incomplete caudal vertebra that didn't just belong to a sauropod, but to the specific group containing the biggest of them all, the titanosaurs. Just like our mystery predator, we don't know the exact genus yet, only that it was a Lithostrosian, a family of titanosaurs that came in all shapes and sizes, ranging from the absolutely massive to the merely large, at least by sauropod standards. Right now, it's a bit of a mystery where exactly the Antarctic sauropods fit into the family tree. On top of that, there's a good chance plenty of other dinosaurs were roaming these parts too. The thinking is that Antarctica was basically a bridge connecting
to the
Australia and South America,
the
linked by temporary
Pleioplatycarpus lived
strips of
during
land,
the late Cretaceous
which clears
period,
up the mystery of
reaching
why we
length
find
full.
specific South
The
American
fossil
dinosaur
evidence,
groups all the
including
way
this
over in
massive
Australia.
skull and jaw
But
segment,
honestly,
confirms
if I
the
time traveled to
Mosasaurus'
Cretaceous
predatory
Antarctica,
nature.
I'm not moving an inch. You couldn't pay me to trek to South America or Australia. And look, it's not like this place was some tropical resort. Remember, exploding volcanoes were still very much a problem. It's just that I'd be terrified to even dip a toe in the ocean, no matter how short the swim. Because the real nightmares? They were waiting in the water surrounding the continent. And yes, that definitely included a heavy dose of thalassophobia-inducing monsters, specifically the mosasaurs. those giant marine reptiles we all know and love. Turns out, you couldn't escape them, even in the frigid Antarctic seas. Between the shallows and the deep ocean, at least 5 different types of mosasaurs were lurking about. One of them was actually the famous Mosasaurus itself, but the version down here wasn't the same beast found in North America. This was Mosasaurus lemurieri, a slightly smaller but still terrifying predator, reaching 10 meters, or 33 feet. What set it apart was its super sharp, pointed snout. Its teeth were weird too, compared to its cousins, smoother and much more slender. That tooth shape, paired with an insanely flexible lower jaw, suggests it used a really nasty feeding technique, ratchet feeding. Basically, it would bite down, hold on tight, and use its jaw like a biological conveyor belt, slowly dragging the victim deeper and deeper down its throat. And chemical studies show it liked to hunt in the deep ocean. It wasn't alone there either. It shared the waters with a medium-sized relative called plioplate carpus. This guy grew to about 6 meters, or 18 feet, and was actually built even better for deep-sea life than its cousin. It had a short, stubby snout and massive eyes to help it see in the pitch black depths, where it used curved, needle-like teeth to snack on soft-bodied prey. But here's the kicker. Even though it loved the deep, dark ocean, plioplate carpus was actually the one you had to worry about near the shore. Fossils of this thing have turned up in ancient riverbeds, which means they probably swam up into fresh or brackish water. So, even if you were inland in Cretaceous Antarctica, you were never 100% safe from a mosasaur attack. And to round out this nightmare roster, you also had the Tanawayasaurus, an 8-meter or 26-foot beast with a snout built like a battering ram. It ate pretty much anything, alongside another unidentified type of tylosaur. Together, these mosasaurs were the undisputed kings of the water,
Cretalamna measured
the top-tier
approximately 5 meters.
But don't get it twisted, they weren't the only giants swimming around out there.
Compared to its massive
Placing the Cretalamna next to the great white that was thriving in the Cretaceous
reveals their size similarities, highlighted by these
around
orange
Antarctica,
comparison lines.
They were doing even better than the mosasaurs, at least when it came to variety. We know of multiple families in the area, including Aristonectes, Elasmosaurs, and the Weddellinaceans.
The jawbone
Now,
fragments,
here's the
though
good news.
incomplete,
While many of these
clearly show the
plesiosaurs were
placement of the
terrifyingly long,
intact,
they
sharp
probably
teeth,
weren't
allowing us to-
interested in eating anything human-sized. They were specialized fish markets, using their long necks to sneak into schools of fish and snatch up any unlucky swimmer that got too close. Basically, they were living nightmares for sushi. But ironically, they had to be careful with their dinner, because some of those fish could bite back, and hard. Alongside the fossils of dinosaurs, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs, we've also found a ton of ancient fish, including some absolute giants with serious jaws. But one of them stood out as the biggest bully in the yard. That would be Cretalamna. This shark was likely the ancestor of the biggest shark to ever exist, the Megalodon. Back in the Cretaceous, though, it hadn't reached that size yet. Fossils suggest that full-grown adults off the Antarctic coast topped out at around 5 meters, or 16 feet long. So, not megalodon-sized, but still huge. Bigger than any bull shark today, and comparable to a massive tiger shark. And like any respectable nightmare of the deep, Cretalamna had rows of razor-sharp teeth built to slice and dice. But the shape suggests they weren't picky eaters, they had an opportunistic diet, hunting anything they could get their jaws on. And we know this for a fact because we've found all kinds of fossils with bitten bones and embedded shark teeth, including other fish. We are talking turtles, squids, rival sharks, and yes, even massive marine reptiles like elasmosaurids and mosasaurs. In fact, some of the targets on their hit list measured over 9 meters, or 30 feet, proving that sharks have always been absolutely fearless hunters.
Graphics
And in the
display
waters
the
of
entire
Cretaceous
long,
Antarctica,
slender, eel-like
the
body of this
Cretalamna
shark
wasn't the
species.
only killer
The
patrolling
camera
the
angle
depths.
switches to 2
Far from
close-up
it.
photos of the
If
actual
you look toward
face
the
of
bottom of
frilled
the
shark.
food chain, you would find familiar faces like angel sharks hugging the seabed, lying in wait to ambush unsuspecting bony fish, alongside dogfish.
Its global distribution
sharks,
is wide
another
but
natural resident
fragmented,
of this ancient
inhabiting the
ecosystem.
dark, cold
Hovering
waters
above
of
the
the deep
ocean
sea,
floor,
where it
but
hunts
cruising through the
elusive prey.
twilight zone, was a now vanished species of cow shark known as Notodonodon. This was a hefty predator, roughly double the size of an average human, and operated as a generalist hunter, much like Cretalamna, just on a smaller scale. However, it preferred the gloom of the deep, whereas its cousin
right here.
stuck
It
to the
seems unusually
sun-drenched
rough.
surface layers.
Yes,
Speaking
the
of creatures
dermal
that love the
denticles in
dark,
this section
there is
are
one shadow
atypical.
dweller
Let
from
me
this
scan it
era that
again.
defied extinction
Examining the
and actually
specimen
still
confirmed its identity
swims our
as a
oceans
goblin
today,
shark, a
representing
creature
one of the
rarely
oldest
seen alive in
lineages
its
on
natural
Earth,
habitat
the
deep
frilled
within
shark.
the abyss.
With its serpentine body, nightmare fuel teeth, and dead eyes, this species has been in the game for a very long time. And back then, the warmer global climate allowed these deep-sea horrors to thrive all the way south in Antarctica. That is obviously not the case anymore, but in those days, they likely hunted exactly as they do now, stalking victims with roughly 300 needle-sharp, backward-facing teeth designed to snag even the slipperiest squid or octopus. They wouldn't turn their noses up at the occasional fish or smaller shark either. And while they look like straight-up movie monsters, frilled sharks are probably more bark than bite when it comes to human-sized threats. A similar story applies to the goblin shark, another deep-sea dweller that sticks to the abyss, and possesses a face so hideous it is hard to look at, hence the name. Despite their ghoulish appearance, modern goblin sharks are surprisingly sluggish and pose virtually no threat to anything big. They rely on a bizarre, slingshot-style jaw to snatch prey, swallowing small animals whole, a diet that, thankfully, doesn't include people. However, the goblin sharks of the Cretaceous period were a different breed entirely, and much more trouble. Enter Scapanorhynchus. Emerging during the Aptian stage, this beast was an outlier in the family tree for a couple of major reasons. First, it didn't hide in the abyss, trading the deep dark for shallow, sunlit coastal waters. Because of this shift, it lacked many of the lethargic traits we see in modern goblins, evolving a massive, powerful tail instead, along with streamlined fins that let it navigate with deadly speed. That was great for the shark, but terrible for everything else, especially since we are talking about a titan. This was the largest goblin shark to ever exist, capable of reaching lengths of up to 6.7 meters, that is 22 feet, and tipping the scales at over 1 ton. Analysis of its teeth suggests it specialized in large fish, but make no mistake, it had the hardware to take down pretty much whatever it wanted, given that its dental layout was a dual-threat weapon designed to grip slippery victims while simultaneously shearing off massive chunks of flesh. It would inflict catastrophic blood loss in seconds. Definitely not a creature you would want to bump into. And much like the plioplate carpus, escaping it would have been tricky, as fossils show these monsters also ventured into freshwater river systems. To make matters worse for any potential time-traveling swimmers, it is believed that Scapanorhynchus used its elongated snout, just like modern goblin sharks do, as a highly sensitive metal detector for biological electrical signals. This means that if you were wading through a murky, brackish river where visibility was 0, you wouldn't see it coming, but it would absolutely know exactly where you were. Ancient goblin sharks were certainly weird, but Antarctica hosted another group of fish that gave them a run for their money in the oddball department, and they were significantly more common back then. I am referring to the chimeras, a group of cartilaginous fish, often called ghost sharks because of their spooky, ethereal look. In reality, they aren't actually sharks at all, but rather close cousins on the evolutionary tree. Today, they are elusive deep-sea oddities, but the Cretaceous was their golden age where they were far more plentiful and diverse.
Careful,
and that diversity wasn't just about their shapes, but also their size.
Look at the eyes on
Modern
this thing,
chimeras are
amazing.
generally petite, rarely heavier than a medium-sized dog. But prehistoric versions, that is a whole different story. Take Edaphodon, for instance. A giant with a bizarre rabbitfish appearance that could grow to 3.43 meters, or over 11 feet long,
comparable in
making
size
it the
to a
heavyweight
scuba
champion
diver.
of the chimera world. Unlike modern chimeras, which are generally harmless, the ancient Edaphodon was a creature you would want to avoid at all costs. You might ask why. Well, aside from being capable of delivering the scare of a lifetime, they possessed some truly bizarre dental equipment. Massive, sharp-edged tooth plates, durable enough to crush hard-shelled prey, while also slicing through larger victims like sharks, fish, and marine reptiles. So definitely keep your hands away from that mouth. Now, I know I have likely worn you out with terrifying sea creatures, but I hate to break it to you, we are not even halfway through the list. The roster also included the barracuda-like Apocalyptic and another extinct shark called Sphenodus, a bull shark-sized hunter perfectly adapted for snagging cephalopods. Clearly, ancient Antarctica was a dog-eat-dog or fish-eat-fish world, but the predation was ramped up by another group entirely. This next group is the final piece of what I call the Mesozoic trifecta, sitting right alongside dinosaurs and marine reptiles. If you need a clue, look to the skies. That is right, we are talking about pterosaurs. Specifically, one massive flyer. In 2019, a wing bone discovered on James Ross Island proved that winged beasts once patrolled these skies. Like many Antarctic fossils, identifying the exact species was tricky. But one thing is certain, this creature was the closest thing to a dragon the continent ever saw. It was massive. Based on the measurements of the bone, experts believe, it sported a wingspan over 5 meters, or 16 feet. That is wider than an African elephant is tall, making it the largest animal ever to fly over Antarctica. While its specific identity remains a mystery, if we compare it to similar pterosaurs, there is a strong chance this enigma was an AZH darkid. That implies fish were not the only ones watching their backs. This predator likely hunted on land, meaning terrestrial critters were on the menu too. It all goes to show that while modern Antarctica is not known for giants, it was once absolutely teeming with them. The irony, however, is that this golden age existed right on the edge of oblivion. Just a few million years later, the party came to a violent end thanks to the late Cretaceous extinction event. You might think that being so far from the asteroid's impact site in present-day Mexico would have provided some safety, sparing Antarctica from the worst of the carnage. But no, it was absolutely devastating, just like everywhere else. Recent studies have specifically highlighted this, debunking old theories that the southern pole might have been a safe haven. One fascinating study analyzed over 6,000 marine fossils from the region, ranging from 70 million years ago to 1 million years after the extinction. The collection was incredibly diverse, spanning from tiny mollusks to medium-sized fish and even giant mosasaurs. The data revealed that precisely when the asteroid hit, there was a catastrophic drop in biodiversity. Around 70% of species vanished, an extinction rate mirroring the destruction seen across the rest of the globe. If you had been standing there on that fateful day, you would have faced a magnitude 4 earthquake, a debris cloud thick as a dust storm, and a superheated atmosphere capable of incinerating anything exposed in the open. To top it off, a 10-meter or 33-foot tsunami would have slammed the coast, a wave height comparable to the one that devastated Japan in 2011. And following that horrific day, conditions only deteriorated. Dust choked the atmosphere and blocked out the sun, triggering a nuclear winter. When it was all over, Antarctica was forever changed, with the non-avian dinosaurs and nearly all Mesozoic megafauna swiftly wiped out. That said, a few Antarctic giants held on for a while, such as Edaphodon and Cretalamna, the ancestor that would eventually give rise to the largest predator of all time. Ultimately, Antarctica did recover in many ways. If you want to know how that recovery played out, check out my other video exploring the continent's last green era. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.